Today's seminar is really about how do we communicate our final wishes to loved ones before a crisis. And as an elder law attorney, I can tell you a quarter of what we do on any given day at our office is crisis work. Something happened to somebody that they didn't want to happen, didn't think was going to happen, and now we're left to make decisions. And it doesn't matter if you talk about finances or healthcare, all of us are really trying to decide the person that's sick right now, what would they have wanted us to do? If they could tell us right now, what is it that they wanted? And that's what this day is about. So today, tomorrow actually is Healthcare Decisions Day. And every year we've spent some time really taking a step back and talking about healthcare decisions and what that means. Now, I know in the materials it talks about the fact that Dr. Nesbitt and I will be co-presenting, but what we've done every year is I really defer my time to him to give us an account from his perspective in the meat of it all, healthcare decisions and what that entails. The one thing I would say to you is that there's always two parts of it. One part is actually having a document saying, this is the person that I want you to talk to. And, if we don't have that document, knowing who you'd want to talk to is really important. But when COVID hit, our office, one of our first responses was to put on our website a free healthcare power of attorney. So it's still up there today, and Kyle can put in the chat our healthcare, our website. If you get on our website for my law office, you can right there download a free power of attorney, fill it out, and have a legal document that allows another person to make decisions for you. Today we'll talk about maybe who that should be. And we'll also talk about, because I know Dr. Nesbitt always talks about how the document isn't good enough. It really fails. So as an attorney, I can tell you, you really need to have the document, but I can also tell you it's not enough. Because the document says, this is who I want to make my decisions, but it doesn't tell us what to do in that circumstance. So in my situation, I have, been appointed by my mom. She's had a lot of ups and downs. And really at the end of the day, I just want to know that I did what my mom would have wanted. And the best way for me to know that is to have a conversation with her, talking to her about right now, given what's going on, this is how she feels about it. This is the type of living that's okay with her. So I'm glad to see so many people get on our virtual event. We just never know, how this will work out. And I think this is one of the most important topics that we do all year. Because at the end of the day, somebody's going to have to make a decision. And the easier it is to get through that crisis situation, the better for everybody. I think too many times people think this is just about families that aren't getting along or have fighting or crisis, and that's not true. Every family wants to do the best job possible in these crisis moments. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Nesbitt to share his thoughts from his vast medical experience and why this is an important topic for everybody.
Okay, thanks, Julie. I do feel like this is a really important topic. I'm glad that you all have tapped in to think about this. I'll start off by telling you my perspective, where I'm coming from. So I was in primary care for more than 20 years, and about 17 years ago began to do hospice and palliative care full-time. I've been chairman of the ethics committee for over 20 years. And I have seen again and again how important this is for us to get this right, and how even in really good medical systems with caring doctors and excellent nurses and everybody trying to do the right thing, we can end up doing the wrong thing if we don't prepare for this ahead of time. And that really means thinking about this in the right way. And I think that what Julia said is really right, that Our document's very important, and I'll talk about that. But the most essential thing is relationship communication that is then reflected in the document. So I will tell you that as a culture, we have somewhat misfired over the last 40 years in terms of how do we think about getting this just right? How do we make sure that when somebody gets really sick and they're in the hospital, that we know the right thing to do and we do the right thing? I think the easiest way to think about this is to focus on specific case. And so I'll tell you about Jack. So Jack is about a 90-year-old guy who has COPD, chronic lung disease, had some heart attacks, has pretty bad arthritis, was married to the love of his life for all of his life up until about 5 years ago when she died. And he's been bumping along at home, has 2 kids, one son who lives nearby, who he's really close with, and one daughter who moved away and who he kind of had an argument with about 5 years ago and hasn't really talked to since that time. Jack is a detailed kind of a guy, insurance agent actually, and so he's completed various documents along the way. And more than 20 years ago, he had completed a living will document with his attorney, and he's got that. And so his son lived with him and then moved away a couple of years ago, got a good job in Rochester, was worried about dad, but his dad, Jack, said, come on, man, go, this is a good job, take it, I'm fine. So every day the son is worried, he calls dad, Dad, how you doing? How's your night? How you doing? One morning he calls, Jack doesn't pick up, which is really unusual because Jack always picks up. So son calls again, doesn't pick up. Son calls the neighbor and says, Dad's not picking up, can you go check on him? When the neighbor lets himself into the back of the house, comes up, he finds Jack halfway between the bed and the bathroom, face down on the floor, breathing like that. Jack has had something really bad happen. So the friend calls 911 and they take Jack to the hospital. And in the ER, they do the testing that shows Jack has had a really big middle cerebral artery stroke. And so a large part of his brain now is damaged terribly by this stroke. And he is deeply unconscious. And he is not breathing very well. And he's not swallowing right now. And it's unclear what's going to happen with Jack. Could he recover some? Is he going to die? He has a high chance of dying, but maybe he could get through this. And I'm the doctor, and Jack is my patient, and I have to decide what will I do for Jack if Jack suddenly chokes and we either intubate him and put him on a vent or not. Or if his heart stops, would he want us to do CPR? Or if 2 or 3 days from now he still can't swallow, would he want us to put an artificial feeding tube in him to feed him that way? Or would he not want these things? We have so many technologies and tubes and interventions that sometimes are wonderful and helpful, but sometimes in some circumstances, people would not want that. Not like this, I wouldn't want that. How do I know what's the right thing to do? This is really important. It's really important for Jack to get what he wants and most would choose. It's really important for his family who loves him to know that we did the right thing for Dad. And for medical people, we who are trying to do the right thing in the hospital, it's really important that we get this right. Well, our model for how do we think about this, how do we get this right, has in the past been the living will paradigm, meaning that, well, we'll figure this out by having you go see your attorney and you have a form and you check off on the form, I want or do not want, check, 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 and you check off specific interventions. And then when you take that form to the hospital, people will know just what's to be done. I've had some situations where I've spoken to attorneys, not Julie, who have said, yes, when I have this conversation, I excuse the family. I ask them to step out so that I can privately speak to the person and document on the form what this person wants. And then once they have the form, that will take care of the problem. Well, that paradigm that is focusing just on the document and not focusing enough on the discussion and the relationships and who is there to know what's to be done is a bit of a misfire. And it hasn't really worked just focusing on the document check off kind of form. And Jack is a good example of this. So Jack had filled out his living will. He had checked off that form. He had it by the door. He had told his neighbor, if I get sick, you take that to the hospital. Well, it turns out that this idea that we'll get people to check off a form and then it'll take care of the problem, when I say that has sort of failed, there's several pieces of evidence why I say that. And one is that most people have not done this. In our country, most people have not completed an advance directive. Unfortunately, in many communities, most people have not completed an advance directive. In some communities, upper middle class white populations, maybe more than 50% have. Broadly across our country, only 30% have done an advance directive or living will. But that's not the worst problem. The worst problem is for that 30% who did this, most of the time that document doesn't make it to the hospital. And I can tell you in our hospital, I know the percentage of those documents that ever make it to the hospital when we're making hard decisions. Because we had some medical students do a study on this a few years ago. And it turns out 11% of people who said, yes, I did a document like this. Could you find that on the chart, even for those people who had died in the hospital? So most people haven't done this, and most of the time that document doesn't make it. But even in times like Jack, where the document was done and it makes it to the hospital because he had thought to make sure that it gets in there, even then a check-off document doesn't solve the problem like we used to think that it would. So Jack, when he had completed this document 20 years ago with his lawyer, the document said, if I am terminally ill or in a permanent state of unconsciousness, I want or do not want. And then there were various things for him to choose. Do you want a feeding tube? Do you want CPR? Do you want dialysis? And he had checked off, no, I don't want CPR. No, I don't want a feeding tube. But he had read that document very carefully. He was a very detailed guy. And he had read the part about if I am terminally ill, meaning that I'm going to die, or permanently unconscious, like I'm never going to wake up, and then had checked off, I don't want these things in that circumstance. But here's Jack in the hospital with a big stroke. Is he terminally ill? Is he permanently unconscious? He's seriously ill and he may die, but he could survive. He is not conscious now, but he may wake up if we do interventions. So the fact that he checked off, I don't want a feeding tube for that form 20 years ago, it doesn't answer the question that we most need to know. In this circumstance, what would Jack want? Unfortunately, we doctors never know for sure, almost never, what's going to happen to people. We know statistics and odds and probabilities and likelihood. We know risks and benefits, but we usually don't know for 100% sure. Sometimes when somebody comes in the hospital, it's pretty clear. Person has had a totally fatal injury. There's no chance of survival. Here's a living will that says, I would not want these things if I were terminally ill. Well, then that could be helpful, but that's a small minority of the cases where we're struggling to know what to do. Most cases are like Jack, somebody who's really sick, and we need to weigh out the pros and cons of different interventions. Well, who would decide for Jack? Who knows for Jack what he most wants? Well, Jack. So if somebody can tell us what they want, they tell us, and then we can follow through with that. But very often, much more than half of the times, when somebody's really sick, the person themselves, they can't tell us, like Jack, he's too sick. In this moment, we have to turn to someone to help us make these decisions. We need a surrogate decision maker, a healthcare agent, somebody who can speak with Jack's voice. Well, who should that be? We tend to say, well, family, well, loved ones. Well, who? Is it the wife? Is it the oldest son? Is it the daughter? Is it these? We don't know who Jack would want us to choose unless Jack has decided ahead Who would I want to speak for me? And has thought about that and has chosen that person and has documented that. So when I say the document idea has failed, I only mean to say that this checkoff form done years before with no conversation, the document itself doesn't fix it, but the document that specifies who do I want to decide for me is super essential. And many people, most people have not done that. Often people feel like, well, my family, they'll know what to do. They love me, or my son, my wife, they probably know. But very often in families, like Julie said, there's stuff in the family. Everybody loves dad, but they love in different ways, or they have different ideas, and it can be a conflict. And I see that at the bedside in the hospital regularly, where everybody's trying to do the right thing, but it's a thrash. And we don't know who should actually have the voice to speak for Jack. So if there's one thing you remember from this session, keep in mind that it is really important to think about who do I want to be my, what we call healthcare agent or a surrogate decision maker or healthcare power of attorney. This isn't necessarily the person that you love the most, because we're not just talking about who do I love, we're talking about who do I want to do this really difficult thing, make hard medical decisions about complex issues in a really emotional time. This is deciding sometimes when it's not clear. Cardiology doctor comes in and says things look a little better. Kidney doctor comes in and he's shaking his head saying things aren't very good. Well, and it's in an emotional time where whatever is decided, yes, we should do that too. No, I don't want that intervention. Sure as heck, somebody's going to say, I can't believe you did that. That's terrible. You should do this. You should do that. So the person that you're choosing, who do I want to make this decision, is somebody you're entrusting to hear all this information and do the very best to make choices that reflect what you would think, what your values are, what kind of living do you think would be okay. Keep in mind also that this process of thinking, who do I want to speak for me and what is most important for me is not what tube do I want. It's not ahead of time saying, I always want a ventilator or I never want dialysis. It could be that. There are some people who say, I would never want dialysis no matter what. But very often the answer to the question comes down to what's the circumstance? So if I were to look at you and say, do you want a ventilator? The right answer is, well, what's the odds? What's the circumstance? If you have a terrible pneumonia and you've got a 90% chance of survival if you get on a vent for 3 days, you might say, well, sure, I'll take a ventilator like that. But if you have a severe advanced disease and it's very likely if you get intubated, you would never get off the ventilator, you might say, well, I don't think I want that. So the real question is, what kind of living is okay for you? What kind of level of dependence or independence or function? What sort of future, what sort of life would be okay and what would be not okay? I would rather be gone than to be like this. I don't want that. That's the kind of thinking that is super important. And we would tend to think that, well, my son, he's really smart. He'll know what I think. But studies have shown that surrogates, loved ones, very often don't know just how you would think about these things. Just because somebody loves you doesn't mean they know how you would think about what level of living would be okay. So this process of advanced care planning, thinking about who would I want to entrust with this responsibility and documenting that, and then speaking with that person and other loved ones who would be involved if you're really sick about what sort of living would be okay. Really, really important. And as I do medical care in the hospital, I see regularly situations where this has never come up. I don't know, we never talked about it. I don't know what dad would want. And when families are put in that circumstance and struggle to make the best decision and choose, they are left with a burden that studies have shown is a really big burden. A year later, people will say, hardest thing I ever did. I still cry when I think about this. I wake up at night and I see mom's face. It's traumatic because they struggled to know, but they didn't know. I also see cases where somebody has talked about these things, I often will use the example of this really large Italian family who 10 years ago I met, where dad, who was this really powerful patriarch with like 10 kids, suddenly had this devastating injury to his brain. And he was in the ICU on a ventilator, and he had bled into his brain in a way that it was super unlikely he was ever going to wake up and function. And we were looking at, should we put him on a trach, so he's on a long-term ventilator, and a peg tube, so he has long-term feeding into his stomach, and move him to a facility where he could be maintained in that way? Or would he not want that? In that case, this father, who was a strong-headed guy, no offense, Julie, but he said, no, I'm not going to see a lawyer. Forget it, I don't see a lawyer. I'm not filling out a paperwork. No, I don't do this. But he had told his family, don't you ever put me on a machines like that. I don't live like that. Don't you do that. And he had said that to his family, and he had told them. And as we stood in that ICU with a room full of kids, everybody crying, so sad, every single person looked at me and said, Doc, don't do it. If you put him on a machine, he's coming back from the day. He's going to get us. No. Half of the kids said, if it was up to me, I'd say, yeah, because I love Dad, but I know what he wants. I don't want you to do that. And with tears, we then stopped the machines Dad would not have wanted and allowed the natural death that he would have preferred over the tubes that could have been done. In that circumstance, he had been so clear, we knew what to do. But in many families, having a document, knowing who is it who would formally speak, if the kids had split, if they argued 5-5, what would we have done? If he would have named who he wants to speak for him, that would give that person his voice. So really important to do this. And I know this is a part of the kind of counseling that Julie and her firm does, is not just here's a form, fill it out, but think deeply about this and talk and make sure that we know, so the document accurately reflects what you most want and who would speak for you. So that's really important to know that this sort of conversation, even before you would see the lawyer in the family, really important. All across our culture, we should be thinking about this and talking about these things amongst ourselves. But if you do not have the documentation completed this way, really important to do it. The last thing I'm going to say before I stop talking here is, as we look to try and make sure that we're doing the right thing, that we're lining care up in the right way, there are two services that I work with that I just want to take a minute to make sure people understand the right role for them and the difference between them. And these are hospice and palliative care. And so hospice is appropriate for somebody who is terminally ill, likely to die within 6 months, wants to focus on comfort-directed care every day until the person comes to their dying day. And then hospice is all over the family and the person, trying to make sure we do the right thing, that you have what you need, that you can be where you want to be. Bring help to your home, to your nursing home if that's where you live. Somebody who is so sick and suffering so much that they need hospice care, but they need a facility for it, coming to the hospice unit at the gatehouse. So hospice is really focused on end-of-life care. Palliative care, and in our community we call it the supportive and palliative care team, is for people who are sick, have some sort of serious or advanced illness. Not necessarily somebody who's within months of dying, but somebody who is sick and having symptoms that they need help controlling, or decisions that are hard where they need additional help thinking this through, talking this forward, or needing help with care planning. How do we line things up so the person and their family can get the help that they need in the right environment? Palliative care can be done in the hospital or the nursing home or wherever the person is. It can be done for people at any age and even years before dying, but somebody who needs that level of help. Sometimes people in palliative care in our service will then get to the point where they need hospice. Sometimes we'll have people who do so well in hospice, they're really no longer terminally ill, they're doing better. Well, then they can sign out of hospice and palliative care can continue to support them. So these are two distinct, somewhat overlapping services that are really focused on trying to make sure that we do the right thing, that the person and their family have the help that they need each step of the way. So that's all that I wanted to say, and I'll just pause for a minute and see what you want to kick in, Julie.
Certainly, I appreciate that. I want to just piggyback on Dr. Nesbitt talking about hospice and palliative care. We certainly help people who are younger and they're planning ahead. We also help a lot of people who are, in the meat of it all. Maybe they have some sort of an illness such as dementia or COPD or congestive heart failure. And we all know it's kind of going downhill, but we're not sure where we're at. And what I find is that many people may have to advocate with their primary care physician still to be able to access these services. It doesn't happen automatically. You have to ask for them. And that there's a lot of differences doctor to doctor. We have a fantastic system here, and certainly I think more responsive than many, but you still have pockets and voids where it's just not something that's going to be offered. And with hospice, I mean, obviously it's really hard because people, there's a stigma about hospice. But I would echo with what Dr. Nesbitt said, that so many times I see people go on hospice and they actually rebound a little. And I think it's the services and the coordinated care that's really helping their symptoms management much better. It seems sad to me that many people only get hospice for a few weeks when they could have accessed it for 6 months. And there's really two reasons for that, besides obviously the journey of the patient, which would be better. But also there's some financial benefits that come with hospice, such as paying for prescriptions. Certainly we're not doing it for that reason, but when I look at it and say, well, somebody could have had it for 5 months longer, and this family's scraping around, trying to find the money for these medicines, that seems unfortunate to me. The other thing is that when we are within the hospice program, it's not just about that person who is dying. It's also about the family and everybody getting ready and prepared for that. And there's some diagnoses, such as dementia, but that's really hard. The amount of caregiving that goes with that, and after somebody passes, there's a huge void. And if we could have gotten in a hospice system earlier, dealing with the grief and the counseling and that part of it, I think we all do ourselves a disservice not to push harder for those symptoms. I can tell you that my father-in-law battled with dementia for 14 years. And there was a lot of ups and downs and a lot of voids, even though I know the aging network. And interestingly to me, even with some of his medicines and behaviors, some of the best help we got were from the teams of hospice and palliative care. And that, in my mind, shouldn't necessarily be the answer, but that was the answer. That was the reality of it. So I urge people to not go to a primary care physician and wait for that primary care physician to bring this up. If you're dealing with a chronic illness, bring it up earlier. Start to get used to it. Maybe it's not something that we need now, but let's understand what it is. Let's see if our primary care physician is open to making that referral and find out where we're at. So at my law office, we do many times, help people advocate to be able to get these services within our community. And sometimes it's just knowing that we need to ask for it rather than waiting till somebody brings it up. And that's not good or bad. When we go into our primary care physician doctor's office, a lot of times they're dealing with the most significant symptom that we're dealing with at that moment. And their job is to help with that symptom at that moment, or whatever, brought us in there, but not necessarily, this journey that we're on together. And all of it comes back down to exactly what Dr. Nesbitt said, which is, communicating with families. I know at my office, we love the nonprofit called the Conversation Project, which is out of Boston, which has fantastic booklets I will share with you, I've done this professionally for 25 years, but when I had to sit down and talk to my father-in-law, I started reading the book saying, well, what should I do? And there was a lot of great ideas about where do you even have the conversation? Should you do it at home? Should you do it at a restaurant? Should it be your house? Should it be their house? So just a lot of great thoughts there. But we find honestly that many people, it's just not the Sunday dinner they're looking for. And so what we find is that many times what we will do is we'll actually help people have that conversation. So at my office, when people come in and we do healthcare powers of attorneys, which are, as we talked about, that this is who I want to make those decisions. Living wills, as Dr. Nesbitt talks about, which really focuses on end of life. We always offer for families to have a joint meeting with me and to talk about that. And it's actually one of the things that's come out of COVID, I have to say, is that I feel like more families are taking us up on that. Because before, maybe the kids live far away and how are we going to organize it? But now we just set up a Zoom. And on that Zoom, I talk about, you're appointed the healthcare power of attorney, and this is what that means. And we can talk about, mom has this diagnosis. What would we do? How would mom want to live? And so I think in that way, I become a little bit more of an instrument through which people have these conversations. They can get off the Zoom and say, oh my goodness, that attorney, like she just kept talking about you dying, mom. No. But, it's easier for me to bring that up because I'm not part of that family. My job is just to help people have the conversation and communicate with each other. And we're finding more and more people are doing that, even when I've already done documents for people. And we could have people on here that already are our clients, have already done the documents and they never did that. But like on a review appointment, they're like, let's talk to my children about this. Who did we appoint? Why did we appoint them? What it is that we would want. I can tell you for sure, the ICU waiting room is not the place for people to find this out. You need to make the best decision, and then we need to communicate that with people. So important to me when we think about that moving forward.
Let me just reinforce how important it is to do this ahead, because the ICU waiting room conversation or the ER conversation, this is regular. We see this all the time. And honestly, even sometimes where somebody has named somebody to be their power of attorney, I've had the conversation where you call the person and say, well, I'm looking at some form your dad brought in, you're the power of attorney. And the person said, what? I am? I didn't know that. When did he do that? Or you're the power of attorney. What? I have no idea what that means. So the preparation ahead, what Julie's talking about, is really important and unfortunately not commonly done enough. There's a lot of discussion in terms of how to better make this information available. And implantable chip, I suspect somebody somewhere has thought about that or talked about it, but I'm not sure anywhere where you would get that done. But there are programs that will allow, for example, there's a program called Vimeo, V-I-M-E-O, which has a video encapsulated communication. Here's what I think, this is what's most important to me, here's who I want to do this, that you can go ahead and have on a little form that is scannable. So it can be scanned and somebody can look at that 2-minute video. And this may actually be a better way to have a transferable, immediately understandable document about your care preferences. There are a number of systems where they're trying to have registries where if you have had an advance directive and you have it thoroughly documented, but it's at the lawyer's office in a different state, or you have a post form that was filled out somewhere else, how do we make sure it is where you are being treated? So there are a number of systems being set up to try and have a registry where you show up at that ER, they can click in, open the registry, and immediately pull up your advance directive document or your post or your power of attorney. There's a lot of roadblocks in the way. There's confidentiality concerns, privacy concerns, and there are a lot of things that are getting in the way of that. But from a system standpoint, both systems, for example, the UPMC system and health system broadly across our country, there is movement in that direction to try and have easier access to documents that are so important for us to know what to do.
Yeah, absolutely. At our office, we use a company called DocuBank if people want to do that. So we have them here at our office, but as Dr. Nesbitt pointed out, we're not open 24 hours a day. We suggest to all of our clients that they give copies of the documents to their loved one. But when you get a call in the middle of the night to come to the hospital, you don't say, oh, I have to stop and, get that. So DocuBank is a company that you can pay yearly. It's a little credit card and they can call the number 24 hours a day and get it sent to them. We find that a lot of clients don't engage with that because there is a yearly fee to it. I generally push it with people who travel a lot. So if you're a snowbird, you go to Florida part of the year, Pennsylvania part of the year, or if you've appointed somebody to make decisions for you that is not who we would typically think you would appoint. Maybe you have 3 kids, but you really want your decisions made by your brother, for instance. I think that's really important that that's easily accessible because it's going to go against a default in the law. So I think it's a really great question. I think the problem, with the microchipping may be that these documents can be changed, and will people want to go through, those iterations with that? But having better access is part of the reasons that the documents fail, because when we need them, we can't get them. We give all of our clients their documents in a folder that purposely really can't easily fit in a safety deposit box. And part of that is you really shouldn't put these things in a safety deposit box. I first became an attorney 20 years ago. If somebody passed away or we needed something, we'd go in and we'd say, there's a power of attorney in there and it appoints this person, and they'd look in, and if it did, they'd give it to you. And we can't do that anymore. If I need to get it into a safety deposit box, I need to file sometimes a petition with Harrisburg, and it can take me 2 weeks to get into that deposit box. And I, as the attorney, must go. I can't send a support staff or a paraprofessional from my office. So the worst place to put these documents is the safety deposit box. You should give them to the people that can use them.
And Julie, while you're on the topic there of the documents, question came in through the chat. Can you clarify the different documents mentioned, what they're used for, POA, living will, advance directives?
Absolutely. So an advance directive is really is both a living will and a power of attorney. So an advance directive is just a document that says today what we would want, in advance. We're directing what we want. And so we often think about healthcare directives as advance directives. Specifically in Pennsylvania, we have 2 documents, and that is a power of attorney and a living will. So a power of attorney can be both healthcare and financial, but today we're focusing on the healthcare part of that. And that's a document. So a healthcare power of attorney is a document that says, this is who I want to make decisions for me. And this could be any decision. It could be that, it's not life-threatening. It could just be that maybe for some reason I have dementia and I can't consent to my treatment, but I'm not going to necessarily die tomorrow, but I need to have some sort of a treatment. So the healthcare power of attorney is able to do that. It also allows us to get access to information. Now that's really covered by a federal law called HIPAA, but in most healthcare powers of attorneys, they deal with those issues. I not only can this person make decisions for me, but they can ask questions. The living will is a document that talks really about end of life. So it basically says, not just making any healthcare decision, but when we're at the point where we might be making a decision to withhold or withdraw some type of procedure, that's when the living will kicks in. And under Pennsylvania law, a few things need to be true. We have to be unable to tell a doctor what we want. Well, of course, because if we can tell a doctor what we want, we just tell him or her, we just talk to them. And the doctor has to really think that we're now in a situation where we're not going to get better. Now there's medical terminology and legal terminology, but we're at that point that, some people think is more black and white. I agree with Dr. Nesbitt. We're often in this gray area. And what it basically says is, things that we don't want. We don't want artificial hydration, nutrition. We don't want CPR. We don't, and in those situations, we're clicking off dialysis. It's usually the form that you see that has all of the yes, no's in that. In that situation, we don't really want to make a different decision for different treatments because we're all in the same situation. This is where we don't think there's any chance that we're going to get any better. And it's just going to artificially prolong our life. Now, again, that's not an exact science, but that's what the living will deals with, that really end of life decision. And what is always balanced with it that makes it so hard. And the reason that we need the person to enter this conversation is so many times the answer to that question is, what type of life is good living for us? We talk about a significant amount of recovery. So what type of life, if we do X and I end up as Y, is that okay with me? And so the document actually talks about a realistic hope of significant recovery. And that's what the document said since 1991 in Pennsylvania. And for people, that can be a different answer. So I always think about my husband and I. So my husband, he's done excavating most of his life. He's probably sitting on a machine right now, digging some hole someplace. He took a few years off caring for his dad who had dementia, but he couldn't wait to get back on that backhoe. So for him, a realistic hope of significant recovery, it's going to include doing some of those things, physically being able to do those things. If he wasn't able to, that would really be upsetting to him. Me, I make my living talking. I don't really care as much, or my life isn't centered around as much movement. And so a realistic hope of significant recovery for me could be different than it is for my husband, Donald. It also can change around the years and where we are in our lives. So myself, I still have children under 18, only one. I'm getting older. But for me, if you had said to me, if something had happened, my husband knows this. If I was in a car accident, and I'm a little stubborn and bullheaded, so he knows, like if I was in a car accident, he was supposed to do everything to save my life. I don't care what I had to go through. If there was any chance that I could be here to raise my children, I wanted him to do everything. He knows that. Once I get my children raised, and maybe I'm in a different part of my life, I don't know if I feel the same way about that. So a realistic hope of significant recovery, what that means can vary based on who we are as individuals. It also can be changed based on where we are in our lives.
The power of attorney document, so important. The living will document, which is incorporated often into the advance directive. It's a component of it. But the thing to keep in mind is that if you've completed the living will part, you can set yourself up for what I call the paper versus person problem. And that's like this. If I say, I want my son, Nathan, to be my power of attorney, and I've talked to Nathan, and I've told him what I want to have done, and I complete the living will form, and on the living will form, I say, I do not want, check, 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 check. And then I'm really sick, and I am in a terminal condition, meaning that I'm likely to die and not get all the way better. But I have a condition where if I receive hydration or nutrition for a week, the doctor says there's a chance I may recover temporarily to a point that would be all right. And Nathan says, well, I think Dad would be okay with this for a short while. But the doctor looking at the form says, I'm looking at the living will where your dad said, no fluid and no nutrition. And so the doctor struggles. Do I follow what the paper says, or do I do what the person says? So what I think is the living will component of that form is really appropriate and helpful for somebody that says, I don't care the circumstance, I feel very strongly I would never want to have X. It's appropriate to document that. But if you have a person that you are entrusting to speak with your voice, to weigh out these decisions going forward, number one, you don't have to complete the living will part. You don't have to check off the stuff on that. It's okay to leave that part alone. And if it is not checked off, then your power of attorney is going to make the judgment for that circumstance what they think. So just sort of a thing to be aware of there.